Hey guys, welcome back to Digital Sunday School. We are in Mark 14 this week. We made it through Mark 13, which I'm really excited about because Mark 13 is tough. It's like wading through tar, but we made it. We made it. So we're in Mark 14. We're back in the narrative part of Mark's book here after we just got through the prophetic bit. So we're going to pick back up with Jesus' last few days before his death on the cross. So turn to Mark 14. We're going to read through verse 11. We're actually going to read, through verse 11. And we'll unpack this particular passage today. And this story that we're going to look at this morning it gets me every time. It really does. And I hope it really speaks to you as well. So let me say a quick prayer and then we'll dive into this passage. Dear Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the truth that's in it, Lord. I thank you for the ways it challenges us and where we are. And I pray that it would really reach to our hard hearts and soften them so that you could sow your seeds of the fruit of the Spirit and the Spirit would work within us. And we would live that out in our lives in the way we interact with each other. And I pray for transformation this morning and every day, Lord. And in your holy name we pray. Amen. All right, so Mark 14, verse 1. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him, Jesus, by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." And while he was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, Jesus, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." 300 denarii would have been about a year's wages. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad, and they promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. Okay. This is an interesting story because it's kind of like sandwiched between. It opens up with this dark passage about the plot to kill Jesus, and it ends with yet another dark passage about one of Jesus' own disciples joining in that plot, and he is the key to how they are going to arrest and eventually have him killed. So. Obviously, we know that story well, but I want us to at least understand the context of that. But in between those two really, really dark bits, there's this really, really bright light of a story that we're going to unpack. It's kind of like if you ever go into a jewelry store or something, or if you just look in like a display case, you'll notice a lot of the times they'll put like the really, really bright reflective stones like diamonds and such. They'll put them on like a black velvet backdrop, and that just makes them shine even more. The contrast just makes them really stand out, and I kind of see that in this story a little bit. You've got the backdrop of this plot to kill Jesus and all the corruption that goes into it, but yet in the midst of it you have this incredible story of this woman honoring the Lord in the way she does. So first of all, this is 2 days from Jesus' actual death, okay? And Jesus knows it. You can tell, I think, from his demeanor and what he says in this passage. He references his burial. He's, of course, told the disciples by now several times very clearly that he is going to die. and be raised again, and they just haven't connected the dots. And this is a passage that, again, doesn't exactly put the disciples in the best light because of their reaction to this lady's devotion. But we'll kind of look at what's going on there. So the way I want to look at this passage is this: there are three groups of people. The way I see it, there are three groups of people in this particular passage. Other than Jesus himself, which of course he's at the center of this passage, but there's three groups of people or three entities. Okay, one is the Pharisees and the priests and scribes. Okay, so the religious leaders. And then the second one is the disciples. And the third is this woman. Okay, so we're going to look at the way each of these kind of view Jesus and what that means. Okay, so just kind of look at these three different points as a way to break it down. So, number one, the religious leaders. Okay, they see Jesus primarily, and this is no surprise, but they see him as threatening. Okay, they see him as threatening. He's threatening the status quo. He's threatening their power structure. He's threatening everything that they know and that they rule and they dominate. And they see him as an outsider, as an upstart preacher from who knows where, way off in the cultural backwaters of Nazareth. Who is this guy? He hasn't come up through our universities and all that. And how dare he come in and challenge our leadership? Okay, so they see Jesus primarily as threatening, right? The disciples in this particular passage, the way I want you to think about the way that they're viewing Jesus, and this doesn't mean all the time this is the way they see Jesus, but in this particular passage, I think they are viewing Jesus primarily as someone who's like pragmatically, I don't know if that's a term that you hear all that often, but basically he's useful to them. Okay? He's useful to them, right? He's useful to them in the sense that he is their leader, he is their Messiah, and they see that, again, we've talked about this, the way they see the Messiah is someone who's going to liberate them from the physical dominion of the Roman Empire. He is going to physically liberate them and set up his new kingdom like in the days of David, right? So they've been arguing about who's going to get to sit on his right and his left and who's going to be first in his kingdom and what all that looks like, and his references to the temple being torn down, they don't really fit into that, and so they just kind of look the other way when he talks about that, and they stick pretty hard with the Jesus that they want him to be, right? And that primarily means he is useful to them for a particular purpose, right? And then there's this woman, and this might make a little bit more sense for why I say the disciples see him as useful. Is because the way that this woman honors Jesus is very, very different from that. Okay, so first of all, this passage I think is a great example of proper worship and devotion to Jesus. Okay, because this woman, she doesn't see Jesus primarily as someone who's useful to her. We don't know what her history is with Jesus. She doesn't ask him for anything. She doesn't meet with the disciples beforehand and say, hey, I was planning on doing this. What do you think about that? And she doesn't, as the disciples we see they criticize her in this passage. She is not trying to figure out like the most efficient way to use this thing that she has of great value. So she sees Jesus, and we're going to use a word here that Jesus uses when he says, she's done a beautiful thing to me. She sees Jesus for the beauty. She sees him as beautiful. And no, I don't mean physically beautiful, but she sees Jesus and his ministry and who he is as beautiful. She shows more insight to Jesus than the disciples have in this passage, which is a little, maybe it's not surprising given some of the other passages we have with the disciples really missing the mark, but it should be slightly surprising because the disciples have been with Jesus, right, day in, day out. This might explain their reaction somewhat because they're showing some jealousy, right? When this lady does this thing, she comes and she doesn't hold back at all. She is totally sold out to Christ. but they respond in a way that shows they're somewhat jealous. They're like, whoa, okay, over the top, little over the top, right? They look at this lady almost as like she's a fanatic. Like, look, like we should have done all things in moderation. You know, you've heard that. That is not the message of the gospel. That's actually kind of a secular kind of moral standard to some degree. Is, look, when in doubt, everything in moderation, right? Because that way you don't go too far in the wrong direction, but you don't go too far in the right direction either, and you're kind of in this middle ground, and maybe that's kind of the safest way to play in terms of life and morality. It's not what the gospel says. The gospel says our Lord demands our life, our all, right? We looked at this several chapters ago when we looked at the great commandment, right? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. There's no section of that that's just left out. That's everything. Everything you are. And so we get a demonstration of that in this passage, which is really, really cool. So, you know, this woman comes to this house where Jesus is having a meal with his disciples, and it describes it this way. She has an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly. The disciples obviously have pointed out the fact that it's worth basically a year's worth of wages. So obviously quite expensive. And she brings it and she breaks it and pours it over Jesus's head. So there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, yeah, we can look at the value, the monetary value of this. It's like I said, it's extremely costly. And the disciples immediately kind of calculate in their heads like, wow, I mean, we could have gotten how much money from this thing. But I don't think that's actually the main idea here. The main idea here isn't how much money is this thing worth. I think there's a little bit more to it. We read from archaeologists and such that these kinds of flasks, this wouldn't have been something that necessarily she went and bought or someone maybe gave as a gift to her. This was probably a sacred family heirloom. This is the kind of thing that you don't just come by. It's been passed down, and it's kind of like it represents sort of the future of her and her family. Like if she were to get married, this would be the dowry that she would probably give to her husband or her husband's family. This represents basically everything that can sustain her and her family moving forward. It's like the ultimate fallback. This is the kind of thing that if the whole world, the rug just got pulled out of under the whole world, you could say, well, at least we've got the alabaster flask of nard. At least there's that. That thing is there as our insurance policy. That's going to cover us. That's what she's bringing. And she doesn't just notice. She doesn't just measure out some droplets. She doesn't just very, cautiously pour a little bit. Like, no, she breaks the bottle, so there's no going back. Have you ever heard the phrase like burning the ships? The idea that, like, let's say you were an explorer exploring the New World forever ago, and you got to a foreign coast, and you told your men, let's burn the ships. And basically that's you telling them, we're not looking back. No matter what we're doing moving forward, we're together and we're going inland. We're not looking back at Spain or England or wherever we came from and wondering like, well, what if everything goes wrong, we'll turn back? No, like that option is done. We're burning the ships, okay? That's like breaking the alabaster flask. That's not a phrase you hear. Let's break the flask of nard. But it's essentially the same thing, right? By the way, just in case you were wondering, I don't know why you would be, but I was. Nard, I was like, hey, I wonder if nard is still that expensive. I don't really hear much of nard. What is it? Obviously, it's some sort of essential oil or perfume. And I looked it up on Amazon, and I could get a bottle of it for like $8.95. So it is not as hard to come by as it was in the ancient world, but at least in those days it was something that you had to get from like the foothills of the Himalayas or something, and it was quite expensive and quite rare. So obviously I'm no expert on it, but there you go. That's nard. So I'm sure because I looked it up on Amazon, I will now get weird targeted ads for nard and other strange perfumes. So that's going to be fun. But anyway, back to the passage. This woman, she breaks the jar, right? There's no turning back. She's not trying to keep a little bit for herself. She's not holding anything back at all. She doesn't try to keep the jar even itself as a container. The jar itself was probably expensive. I think I mentioned archaeology a few minutes ago, but something that apparently archaeologists have found is these kinds of family heirlooms, jars of expensive perfumes, would be found like in the burial, in the caskets or the tombs of people that were buried in this time. So like they would take it to their grave many times because it was so valuable, and they would maybe pour it out over the body as preparing the body for burial, right? So what she's doing is she's taking what would have been hers or her family's, and she's giving it to Jesus instead. So it's pretty cool. It's a very, very selfless act, and it's self-forgetful too. This is a slight distinction there. Self-forgetful in the sense that she doesn't really care what other people are thinking, right? She's not looking around seeking approval. She's not doing this to make a big show. It is a dramatic act, but she's not doing it for anyone other than Jesus. I think that's pretty clear, right? So it's very, very self-forgetful, and she's burning the ships. She's breaking the flask. She's essentially pouring out her future onto the head of Jesus. That's what this act means for her. That's how significant it is, right? And she is honoring Jesus and recognizing how beautiful he is and his ministry is and who he is. So again, like I said, this is a model, I think, for worship in a lot of senses. It's a model for worship in the way that worship shouldn't be something that we are thinking about, how do other people see us worshiping? We shouldn't be putting on a show. We shouldn't be holding back. The whole idea here is that we're saying, you know what? I'm giving you my all, God. I'm giving you my all because you gave me your all. I recognize that. And it's self-forgetful. It's selfless. It's all of these things. And this is what this woman does. So much different than the way the disciples act in this passage, and of course extremely different from the way the religious leaders act in this passage in reference to Jesus, right? So they don't really understand. One of the things that's really interesting is the way the disciples act is they more or less they say, this doesn't make sense. What you're doing right now, it doesn't make sense. Let's talk about the numbers. They don't add up. It doesn't make sense. We could have fed the poor with all this. Think of all the money we could have gotten from this, right? Now we know they're not really saying that from the right heart. They're not saying that from a genuine desire to help out the poor. John, who also recounts this story, tells us that Judas was the one leading the forefront of this particular criticism. He's not the only one, obviously, because it's pointed out that it's multiple disciples that are saying this. But we know that Judas, he keeps the books with the disciples. He holds the money bag, and we know that he likes that because he occasionally gets a little bit out of there for himself. And we see obviously at the end of this particular passage that Judas's sin of greed eventually gets the best of him when he decides he is going to sell Jesus out for money. So in contrast to that, this woman has she is totally sold out on Jesus, right? Totally sold out. And sometimes when we run into someone who is totally sold out on Jesus, it's convicting, it's challenging, and our response is not necessarily the right response. It's not one of recognizing like, wow, I need to be like that, right? The disciples don't, you would hope that a response to this would be like, this was incredible, right? The disciples, they're the ones that have been with Jesus this whole time. They've seen him go up against all these different challenges, right? So you'd think their response would be like, wow, here's a woman who is finally, there's someone who really recognizes Jesus for who he is, and she is honoring him in this incredible, beautiful display. That's something that we should really celebrate and encourage. No, their response is grumbling, basically. Like, oh my gosh. Like, please, the drama. This is too much. Too much. Lady, like, you should have talked to us first. This doesn't really make sense. And worship, in some senses, doesn't make sense. I know I use the word sense a lot in that sentence, but I mean, there it is. There are some things that from our Western, again, pragmatic, utilitarian viewpoint, we like to say everything, should make literal sense. It should be useful in some, like, obvious way. Well, sometimes the worship of the Lord isn't like that. It would be easy for us to look at maybe missions, and many have, especially in the secular world, and they'll be like, look, I mean, I get it if you want to go tell, kids in Africa or in Asia or wherever about Jesus Christ. But I mean, if you're going to use so many funds and so much manpower to do that, at least build a hospital or build a school or, teach them literacy or something like that. And there are many great missions that do that, and that is the way that they're able to do that and be supported by the governments that allow them to do that. But there are some ministries that basically what they do is they tell people about the gospel. And from a secular perspective, that's a waste. That is a waste. From a purely secular perspective, from one that does not believe in God, that is a waste. You're taking all this money, all this time, all these people to go and tell people about this man. But from a Christian perspective, we should see that as something that is actually something that should be commended. That is the most valuable thing you could bring, is the gospel. It is much more valuable than just physical sustenance. That has value too, and Jesus doesn't say that it doesn't, right? But it's more valuable than all of those things. It's more valuable than a hospital. It's more valuable than an education system. It's more valuable than, anything else you could mention than clean water wells. All these things are incredible for communities, and they're great. They're things that we've been charged with as disciples, which, don't get me wrong, those things are excellent missions. They're excellent missions, and they're something that Jesus, obviously, he has a heart for caring for this world and for the people in this world. But if those missions are divorced from the gospel, right, they're only temporary fixes for the lives of those people. Because ultimately what we all need, what we all crave, is the gospel. We all crave the salvation that only Christ can give, right? So if those things open up doors for individuals to be saved, to hear the gospel, if they open up doors, or they're a pathway to those things are excellent. But apart from the gospel, those efforts are just futile. So anyway, all that said, this is the way that the Lord, that this woman honors Jesus, and I think it's beautiful. And notice that it's pretty neat the way that Jesus then turns around and speaks of her. He says that she's done a beautiful thing to me, and he says that she's anointed my body beforehand for burial. We don't know if she actually had some kind of special insight from the Lord that she knew about his coming burial, or if she did this and it, unknowingly she anointed him. I think of, there's this passage that is kind of neat when you read it in relation to this passage, especially noting the way this passage opened with the religious leaders plotting against Jesus, and then this woman anointing him. Psalm 2. Okay, we read this psalm in our study of the Psalms. I'm just going to read the first couple lines, but Psalm 2 says this: "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed." Okay, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. He is literally anointed in this passage. He, of course, is the Lord's anointed. But it's interesting. It's almost like the Lord used this woman to have him anointed in this particular passage. And we have the rulers of this people plotting against Christ. But yet they, in doing so, they're actually fulfilling the prophecy from ages ago. So we can see even in this that the Lord's hand is very much orchestrating all of what's happening. It's kind of neat because I think Jesus probably has a somewhat somber and increasingly somber demeanor as he heads towards his death. He knows where he's going, right? He knows what he's facing. He knows the incredible suffering that is coming, but yet he experiences this from this woman. It's a neat picture of grace and a neat picture of how this woman honors him. And then he turns around and honors her, right? He says, "And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her," right? And we're a living fulfillment of that this morning, right? We're reading this passage. This woman who is nameless in the Gospel of Mark and seemingly comes out of nowhere to do this incredible deed, she is remembered in history for all time because of what she's done, right? So her name, or when I say her name, I mean like who she is remembered where the great kings of the earth and princes and rulers and gladiators and champions have all been forgotten by history. This woman has not. And it shows you that the path to true honor is actually honoring the Lord. That's the path to true honor. Not in seeking to elevate yourself or accomplish some great deed. The path to true honor is honoring him. There's another small verse in Scripture that I think is somewhat prophetic of this particular passage, and that's from Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 7:1 says this: "A good name is better than precious ointment or perfume." And again, this woman is a living example of that. A good name is better than precious ointment, right? She decides to pour that out on Jesus because she recognizes he is far more valuable than anything that's in that jar. She is giving her life in its entirety, not holding anything back, to Christ. And that's what we're called to do as disciples. One other thing I wanted to leave you with this particular passage. This is a challenge, and this passage, by the way, I think should be challenging. It's challenging to me for sure, in the way that I see my devotion to the Lord, and I think about what are the things that I might be holding back. Am I devoted in worship to the Lord like this woman is? Do I react maybe how the disciples do? How do I see Jesus? Do I see him as beautiful, or I see him as something that's useful to me? Do I see Jesus as some sort of cosmic rabbit's foot, or like a Coke machine? Like if I need something, I'm going to go bang on it and give it, the right money and get what I need out of it. Or am I just going to need a good luck charm? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes that's how we treat God. And we don't celebrate the beauty of who he is. And so that is certainly a challenge. One last challenge is this. You can read tons of these. There's lots of studies that more or less what they say is that most young people in America, they think that Jesus' role in their lives, so people that profess belief in Jesus, they think that Jesus' role in their lives is to make them better people and to help them live better lives. In other words, kind of like a useful accessory. Again, that's kind of the way that I wanted you to see how the disciples view Jesus in this passage. To help them be better people and help them live better lives. And if that's what you think about Jesus, think about this. As soon as you feel like Jesus is no longer useful to you, then you abandon the church, right? Because this is a whole nother lesson, but it's a very consumerist mentality that we have in the United States. It's a consumerist mentality where we come to anything, but we come to church with this attitude of, okay, what am I going to get out of this? What am I going to get out of this, right? Or we come to our faith like, Lord, I'm going to follow you down this road, but what am I going to get out of it? Or I'm going to be faithful because I want you to answer these prayers. And I want you to answer them honestly the way I want you to answer them. When I want you to answer them. And as soon as I start getting the feeling that you're not doing what I want you to do, or you're not being useful to me in some way, you're not helping me become a better person or live a better life or achieve my goals better, then all of a sudden I start doubting, do I need Jesus? Do I need Jesus to live the way I want to live? That's such a backwards way of thinking, but that honestly is the way many of us can think if we're not properly oriented on who Jesus is and what he should be in our lives. If we see him as primarily useful to make us better people and to live better lives, that's a consumerist mentality. And as soon as that is put in question, we leave the church. There are tons and tons of young people that will do that and have done that. And I don't want y'all to be in that category. I don't want that stat to be you. I don't want that stat to be anybody. But I certainly don't want it to be you. I don't want you to doubt. I have talked with plenty of young people. This isn't just some nebulous stat that I've read in some research somewhere. I've talked to plenty of young people that's their story. That is exactly their story. They will say, look, I was going to church all this time and it was great. And then one day I just felt like I wasn't getting anything out of it anymore. I wasn't. It wasn't speaking to me. I wasn't having this religious, spiritual experience that I felt like I should have. And so I just decided, like, why go? Why go anymore? Why be there? And maybe I can be involved in some other things over here and over here, but if I don't feel like I'm being spiritually moved in some way, or I don't have an emotional, dramatic experience, then I just feel like it's time to check out. There's something very, very wrong with that approach. And again, don't hear me as just being really, really harsh on that. I can understand that, right? I've felt those things as well. When there's a lot of pressure, I think, from our society that we really have to feel a particular way for something to be real. Now, let me tell you something. The reality of Jesus and his gospel and his salvation, it doesn't change based on how we feel. Reality does not adjust based on our feelings. It just doesn't. So the gospel tells us that we are the ones that need to conform ourselves to be molded to be like Christ, not Christ to be molded like us. And that I think is maybe what's at root there, is we really want to mold Christ into what we want him to be instead of the other way around, right? And Jesus says, look, if you're coming down this road, it's gonna be hard. There are gonna be times when it feels dry, and maybe it feels empty, and maybe you feel like you don't know what I'm doing. But do you trust me? Have you decided to say, I am going to surrender everything for you? Because that's what this woman did. She didn't ask for anything in return. She's not, placing a bet. No, she had made her decision that she was going to honor the Lord. And that's what she did. So let's look to her as a great example, something we can aspire to in the way that we worship our Lord and are devoted to him in our walk with Christ. Thanks for watching. I will see y'all next week.